The first thing Commander Verathsal noticed about the human soldier was the scar. It ran from the left corner of his jaw down the side of his throat, vanishing beneath the collar of his environmental suit. The kind of scar that didn't come from surgery or accident, but from something that had wanted very badly to keep going and had been stopped. She stood at the upper observation deck of the Luminant Conv, watching the ground crew load supplies below, and she was aware of him before she knew she was aware of him because he was the only person on the landing platform not moving. Everyone else scrambled: dock workers, logistics personnel, her mother's aides with their data slates and their nervous energy. But this human stood at the base of the ramp with his hands loose at his sides, and his eyes moving in a slow, methodical sweep across the perimeter, and he looked at everything with the same flat, unhurried attention, like he was reading the landscape the way she read a medical manifest. She didn't know his name yet. She decided she didn't need to. "That's your escort," said Verathsal's aide, Pelu, appearing at her elbow with a beverage neither of them had asked for. Pelu had a talent for materializing with unwanted drinks at conversational pivot points. Sergeant First Class Marcus Dane. 2 tour on the outer perimeter, 3 confirmed engagements with Keth Raider columns, 1 commendation for field medical. "He's a human." "Yes. Mother assigned a human to protect me." "Your mother assigned the best escort available in the Sabano district to protect you. He happens to be human." Pelu offered the drink again. Verathsal ignored it. Below, the human Dane had finished his sweep. He produced a small device from his chest pocket, checked something on it, and put it away. Then he turned and looked directly up at the observation deck. He couldn't possibly know she was there. The glass was polarized. And yet the look was precise, unhurried, right at her face, and it held for exactly 2 seconds before he turned away again. "He's human," Verathsal said again, but the confidence in her voice had already started to curdle into something less comfortable. She descended to the platform because she had no choice. She was the foremost bionics specialist in the Dreneth Imperium, called to the wasteland settlement of Sabano, because 3 of her kind's deep-ground relay nodes had gone dark simultaneously, and someone in high command had decided that the most efficient solution was to send the person who designed them in the first place. Verathsal had agreed because the problem interested her. She had not agreed to a human escort. She had not been asked. Dane met her at the bottom of the ramp. He was shorter than she'd expected most humans were, to Drenathi eyes with brown skin weathered by exposure to toxic particulate, eyes that were some indeterminate color between gray and green, and the permanent squint of someone who spent significant time looking at horizons. He carried a pulse rifle slung across his back and a compact sidearm at his hip, and his environmental suit was the older military-issue type, with the ceramic plating worn down at the shoulders. Not new equipment. "Not shiny." "Commander Verathsal," he said, not a question. "Sergeant Dane." She looked at him the way she looked at malfunctioning bionics components, clinically, noting deficiencies. "I want to establish something clearly before we proceed." "All right. This assignment was not my choice. I function best when operating independently, and I have no particular need for." "I know," he said. "My job isn't to make you comfortable, it's to keep you alive until you fix what's broken. You don't have to talk to me or like me. You just have to not run ahead without telling me first." He paused. "There's a secondary Keth presence detected 7 kilometers northeast of our primary route. We're taking the long way around through the dried river basin. The scramblers in that terrain block their long-range targeting. We leave in 40 minutes. He turned and walked away. Verathsal stood on the platform for a moment, which she did not often do. She was not accustomed to conversations that ended before she finished having them. "He does that," Pelu said mournfully from behind her. "I've already seen him do it twice this morning." The wasteland outside Sabano's perimeter had once been a functioning agricultural zone. Verathsal could see the ghost architecture of it in the terrain. The raised irrigation ridges now choked with gray mineral dust. The collapsed support frames of growing enclosures reduced to rusted ribs against the sky. The scattered cairns of fractured ceramite that had been storage units before WWII's final years had burned through this hemisphere like a cleaning fire that didn't care what it cleaned. 31 years since the war's end. 60% of the human population dead. And then, more slowly, the rest of the galaxy had taken notice of what humanity had done to itself and to its worlds, and had decided that notice was insufficient, that understanding was required, and that proximity was how you understood things. The Dreneth Imperium had come to understand humanity from extremely close range. Varath Sal walked in the center of a diamond formation, Dane at point, 2 Drenathi security personnel at the flanks, the tech specialist Marin trailing with the equipment load. The dried river basin was exactly as miserable as it sounded, a long, winding corridor of cracked gray clay with walls of eroded sedimentary rock rising on either side, occasionally broken by the rusted hulk of pre-war machinery. Their boots raised small puffs of alkaline dust. The particulate filters on their suits worked steadily. "How much do you actually know about bionics?" Dane asked from point position, not looking back. "I designed 3 of the 4 primary relay architectures currently used in Drenathi neural infrastructure," she said. "The 4th was a collaborative project, but the critical bridging algorithm was mine." "I know, I read your file." He turned to check their left flank, then resumed walking. "I meant the relay nodes that went dark. You know what caused it?" She considered whether to answer, which was a novel experience. She rarely considered whether to share information. Information was either relevant or it wasn't. "No, the signature doesn't match any known failure mode. That's why I'm here, rather than a maintenance team." "Could be the Keth." "The Keth don't have the technical capacity to interfere with Drenathi bionics infrastructure." He was quiet for a moment. They picked their way around a section of collapsed riverbank. "The Keth 2 years ago didn't have that capacity," he said. "The Keth I've been watching for the last 6 months are running hardware I don't recognize." Varath Sal slowed. "You've been watching them." "It's what I do." "That's an intelligence function. You're an escort sergeant." "I used to do other things." He stopped, held up a fist, the universal signal that everyone on the perimeter learns before they learn anything else. The formation went still. Silence, except for wind through the rock walls. Then Varath Sal heard it, a faint harmonic vibration, barely at the edge of audibility, coming from somewhere in the rock above them. She'd heard that frequency before. She'd built systems that produced that frequency. "Get down," Dane said very quietly. Not a shout, not even urgent, just exact. She got down. The rock face on their right exploded outward in a shower of ceramite fragments as something very large and very fast came through it. And then everything happened in a compression of sound and movement that her brain would take several hours to decompress into a coherent sequence. The shape that came through the rock wall was bipedal, approximately 3 meters tall, and covered in a carapace of what appeared to be salvaged military plating, fused to a biological frame with evident disregard for the biological frame's opinion on the matter. It was a Keth war form, but modified, augmented, carrying something in its primary grip that glowed with the faint blue pulse she associated with Bionic's power cells. Dane's pulse rifle was already up and firing before she registered the motion of him raising it. The shots were good. They were very good centermass grouping on a moving target while he himself was moving laterally, putting himself between her and the war form. But pulse fire at that range against that plating rating did approximately what you'd expect, which was not enough. The war form turned its attention toward him with the particular quality of motion that suggested recalculation rather than pain. "The joint behind the left knee," Varath Sal said. "What?" The Keth war form plating was contracted through Drenathi military supply. The joint behind the left knee is the weakest articulation point in the base design. There was a cost reduction decision in the third production cycle. She was already moving, which was not something she had consciously decided to do. 12 degrees below horizontal on the medial face. He didn't ask her how she knew. He fired. The war form dropped, not dead, but down, the left leg folding at that precise 12-degree point, and the massive frame hit the clay floor of the river basin with an impact that sent dust in all directions. It was still moving, still reaching, and Dane was on it with the sidearm at a range that made the plating rating irrelevant, and then it was not moving anymore. Silence settled back over the basin. Dane crouched beside the warform and looked at the glowing component in its grip. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Verath. "That's from one of your relay nodes," he said. She crouched beside him. It was. There was no question. She recognized the fabrication signature, the microcircuit density, the distinctive housing that she'd specified herself because the standard housing had a vibration dampening coefficient that she'd considered inadequate. Someone had removed it from the relay node and given it to the Keth, or the Keth had taken it. "What does it do?" Dane asked. She turned the component over in her hands. Her hands were very still. She was known for still hands. Her colleagues sometimes commented on it. In context, in the relay infrastructure, it manages signal routing across the neural bridge network. She paused. Removed from that context and adapted, it could theoretically be used as a proximity override signal. You could use it to take local control of any bionics interface within broadcast range, including augmented humans. She looked at him. Yes. Including Drenathi neural interfaces. Yes. He stood up, dusted the gray clay from his knees with 2 brisk swipes and said, "All right, we're not going to the relay nodes. I beg your. Someone wants you close to those relay nodes. That's why they're dark enough to need the expert but not destroyed. Whatever they've built into that installation, they need you near the bionics signal range to make it work." He looked at the component in her hands. "We're going somewhere else instead. I have a mission directive." "Your mission directive was issued by someone who either didn't know or doesn't care that you're walking into a trap." His voice was entirely matter-of-fact, which was the most unsettling quality a voice could have in this context. "There's a settlement about 9 clicks west. Mostly humans, some Drenathi civilians, a few others. They call it the Terminus. I've been using it as an information exchange for about 4 months. Someone there knows who's been modifying the Keth. And why would you take me there, instead of reporting this through official channels?" He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes. "Commander, the component in your hands was removed from a relay node that is under Drenathi military control, with Drenathi authorization codes, through Drenathi maintenance access logs that someone edited." He picked up his pulse rifle and checked the charge. "I'm not sure official channels is where you want your first call right now." Verath stood in the gray alkaline dust of the river basin with a stolen piece of her own design in her hands and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not in control of the variables. "Lead on, Sergeant," she said. They walked for 2 hours after the river basin before either of them spoke about what had happened there, and when they did it was Verath who opened the conversation, which surprised her because she was not generally the one who opened conversations. "The joint articulation data," she said. "It was in the 3rd-generation production contract, public procurement record. Anyone with access to Drenathi military supply documentation could have known it. But you knew it immediately, without looking it up." Dane was keeping his pace steady, scanner in hand, eyes on the terrain ahead. "You held the component, and you knew the failure point in the equipment that component was built to work with." "I know all my components," she said, "and all the systems they interface with. The relationships between them." She was quiet for a moment. "When I design something, I know it entirely. Every stress point, every efficiency ratio, every place where the design makes a choice between competing constraints. Those choices are the interesting parts. Everyone else focuses on what the system does. I focus on what the system decided. Is that how you found the failure point, the decision it made? The cost reduction decision in the third production cycle compromised the medial joint articulation at precisely the point where the load-bearing calculation assumed robust material bonding that the cheaper manufacturing process didn't actually achieve. She paused. It was a bad decision. I said so at the time. The procurement committee said the risk was within acceptable parameters. Dane was quiet for a moment. What were the acceptable parameters? The joint would hold under all standard operational loads. It would fail under sustained high-impact combat stress. She looked at the terrain passing under her boots. The committee calculated that a war form would be unlikely to experience sustained high-impact combat stress because war forms were designed as deterrents, not primary combat assets. How did that work out? The Keth used them as primary combat assets in the Haleth campaign 11 years ago. 43 Drenathi personnel were killed when war forms they believed to be neutralized reactivated. She paused. The committee reconvened. The joint articulation was not redesigned because the production cycle for the war forms had been discontinued. There was no mechanism by which the information could improve anything. Dane made a sound that was not quite a word. It communicated comprehension and a specific kind of tiredness simultaneously. You were at Haleth, she said. He didn't answer immediately. They navigated a section of broken terrain where the clay had heaved into irregular ridges. The remnant, Verathsal guessed, of some seismic event in the post-war years when the geological instability had been significant. He picked the path through it with automatic efficiency, touching her elbow twice to redirect her around unseen obstacles. Not as a soldier, he said finally. I was a medical secondary. Trained for field triage. He paused. I was also part of the evaluation team that went in afterward to document what had happened for the after-action report. And the after-action report said everything it was supposed to say. 43 dead, tactical errors at command level, recommendations for improved sensor protocols around deactivated war forms. He stopped at a rise, checked the terrain beyond, continued. The committee reconvened. The recommendations were accepted. The procurement cycle was not reopened. And you were? I was someone who knew what the sensor protocols couldn't account for because I'd been in the aftermath, and the after-action report was accurate but it wasn't right. He said it without heat, which is a thing that happens. Reports are accurate because accuracy is what they measure themselves by, and the things they can't measure stay outside the document, and eventually people who were there stop talking about them, because talking about them doesn't change the document. Verathsal looked at him. Is that what happened to your jaw? He touched the scar without seeming aware he was doing it, a reflexive gesture, the hand moving before the thought completed. Haleth, he said. Follow-up action, 18 months later. He dropped his hand. Sensor protocols in place exactly as recommended. The protocols worked. The sensor was in the correct position, correctly calibrated, correctly maintained. A brief pause. The person operating it made a human error, because humans make errors, and the protocol assumed a level of sustained attention under stress that is not achievable in extended field conditions, because the protocol was written by people who had not been in extended field conditions when they wrote it. And you were the one who. Someone had to. He had the tone of someone stating an obvious physical law. Someone had to go back in and get the people who were still alive, and I was there and I knew the terrain and I knew the war forms. He checked his scanner. The protocols have been revised twice since then. I was consulted for the second revision. The second revision is better. He looked at the horizon. The person who made the error was not disciplined. They were redeployed. Which was the correct decision? Verath-Sol filed this away. The story of the scar, not the mechanics of how it was made, but the architecture behind it. Someone who went back in because someone had to. Someone who understood that the protocol was inadequate, and rather than being bitter about its inadequacy, had participated in making it less inadequate. Someone who had been consulted for the revision because the people revising it knew who understood the terrain from the inside. "You're not an escort sergeant," she said. "I'm currently an escort sergeant." "That's not what I meant." He glanced back at her, just briefly. "I know what you meant." They walked. The terminus was built into the shell of a pre-war resource processing facility. The kind of massive, utilitarian structure that the architects of the pre-war era had designed for function with complete indifference to aesthetics, which meant it was ugly in a way that had actually proven useful for 3 decades of post-war habitation. The outer walls were reinforced ceramite 6 meters thick. The internal structure had been divided, subdivided, and divided again into a warren of living spaces, workshops, storage cells, and common areas that reminded Verath-Sol of nothing so much as an organic tissue sample at high magnification, chaotic, dense, and somehow functioning. It smelled of cooking, machine oil, human bodies, and something chemical she couldn't immediately identify. "Stay close," Dane said. "Let me do the initial contact. Some of the people here have history with Drenathi military." "Negative history." "Complicated history," which is the same thing to most of them. He navigated through the outer market area with the ease of someone who'd done it many times, nodding to people, sidestepping a group of children playing with what appeared to be a repurposed survey drone, exchanging brief words with a broad woman at a food stall that resulted in 2 sealed ration packets appearing in his jacket pocket. He moved through the place the way water moves through terrain, finding the paths that already existed rather than forcing new ones. Verath-Sol was aware of the looks she received, some neutral, some not. She was in her military-grade environmental suit with Drenathi insignia on the shoulder panels. And she was what she was, and this was a human settlement, and the recent history of human settlements and Drenathi military personnel was the kind of history that stays in the bones long after the official accounts have been filed and archived. She made herself walk steadily. She did not alter her pace. They descended into the facility's lower levels, where the lighting changed from the pale natural fill of the upper market to the amber working light of industrial spaces. The chemical smell grew stronger. Dane stopped at a door that looked like every other door in the corridor, heavy, sealed, unremarkable, and knocked in a pattern. 3, pause, 1, pause, 2. The door opened. The room beyond was a workshop. Benches covered in disassembled components, tools racked on wall-mounted boards with the obsessive precision of someone who had learned that missing tools cost time and time cost lives. Screens displaying data streams that Verath-Sol recognized as bionic signatures, and several that she didn't, which was the kind of thing that made the hindbrain interesting. At the central bench, working on something small with tools too delicate for the broad, scarred hands holding them, was a person of indeterminate age and considerable presence. They looked up when Dane entered. Their eyes went to Verath-Sol and held there, assessing, and Verath-Sol had the unusual experience of feeling assessed rather than being the one doing the assessing. "Marcus," the person said, voice low, careful, "you brought a Drenathi." "I brought the Drenathi," Dane said. "Verath-Sol, she designed the relay nodes." A longer pause. "I know who she is." "Then you know why she's here." The person set down their tools and stood, and Verath-Sol saw that the right arm, from shoulder to fingertip, was fully bionics. Not the medical prosthetic kind, not the Drenathi neural interface kind. Something else. Something built in pieces from components that she recognized and components that she absolutely did not, and the integration was rough in some places and brilliant in others, and she could not stop staring at it. "My name is Irene," the person said, "and you're looking at my arm." I apologize, Verethsal said. The integration between the servo drive components at the elbow articulation and what appears to be a modified Keth signal processor in the forearm. I've never seen that done. It shouldn't work. The interface protocols are entirely incompatible. Irene looked at her arm, then at Verethsal. It took me 4 years to make it work. How? Something shifted in Irene's expression, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a specific type of person, the type who asks how instead of why. Sit down, Irene said. We have a problem to solve, and I think we might be more useful to each other than either of us expected. The problem, as Irene laid it out over the following hour, was older than the dark relay nodes. It was older even than the Keth modifications. It had started, as many problems did, with a rumor. 3 years ago, scattered reports from the deep wasteland settlements, the ones too small and too far to rate a designation number, had described a city, not a ruin, not a settlement, a functional, powered, maintained city, visible from the high ridgelines on clear days as a cluster of lights on the horizon that shouldn't have been there. People who'd gone toward it had sometimes come back and sometimes hadn't. The ones who'd come back had been changed in ways that were difficult to describe precisely, calmer, somehow, purposeful, and possessed of knowledge about their own biology, their own neural architecture, that they hadn't possessed before. The city was called Oz. Nobody knew who'd named it. It had been called that as long as the rumor had existed. Someone in that city, Irene said, has developed a bionics interface that can read and rewrite neural architectures, Dranathi and human, any species with a nervous system, probably, given what I've seen in the people who have come back from there. She moved her bionics arm, and the subtle sound of integrated components was like a musical instrument Verethsal had never heard. The relay nodes your people built, they're not dark because they failed. They're dark because something in Oz has taken them over and started using them as a broadcast network. A network for what? For mapping every mind connected to any Dranathi bionics interface within broadcast range. Irene met her eyes. Including your high command's neural staff, including the officers with command authorization codes embedded in their neural architecture. If someone can map those codes, they can issue commands that appear to originate from within Dranathi High Command, Verethsal said. Her voice was very flat. This was a thing she did when she was processing something that the rest of her had not yet caught up with. Dane was leaning against the workshop doorframe with his arms crossed. He'd been listening with the quality of attention that she'd started to recognize in him, absolutely still, missing nothing. There's more, he said. Tell her the rest. Irene looked at him, then at Verethsal. Whoever is in Oz sent the Keth to collect you specifically, not just an expert, you. Because the relay nodes have a security layer that defaults to responding only to biometric signals within 2 standard deviations of the original designer's profile. To access the core architecture, they need someone close enough to you to spoof your biometric identity. A pause. Or they need you. The room was quiet for a moment. My mother, Verethsal said. She authorized my deployment. She authorized Sergeant Dane's assignment. She has access to Dranathi military deployment protocols. She heard herself saying the words with the analytical part of her brain, the part that processed uncomfortable data without inflection. Is she? We don't know, Dane said, with a directness that landed like a hand on the shoulder. We don't know who in the command structure is compromised. That's why we're here instead of calling it in. She sat with that for a moment. The ambient sounds of the terminus settlement filtered through the workshop walls, voices, movement, the distant clang of metalwork, somewhere the sound of a child demanding something with the single-minded intensity that only small children could sustain. You said people who went to Oz and came back were changed, Verethsal said finally to Irene. Changed how specifically? peaceful, purposeful, like they'd been told something important about themselves that they'd been missing. Irene turned her bionics arm over, studying it. I went to Oz 6 years ago, before any of this, before I knew what it was. Silence. And Dane said. And someone there rewrote 6 months of my memory. Her voice was flat and factual in the same way Verath Sal's was flat and factual, and Verath Sal recognized it for what it was. The voice of someone who had long since processed the rage about something and arrived at the cold, usable residue on the other side. I don't know what I knew before I went in. I don't know what they took. I know what they left, because what they left is this. She raised the bionic's arm, and the 4 years it took me to rebuild the rest from what I could remember, and a very specific need to find out what's in that city before it does to someone else what it did to me. Verath Sal looked at Dane. I know, he said before she could speak. We're going to Oz. They went at dawn. 5 of them, Verath Sal, Dane, Irene, and 2 of Irene's people from the terminus. A Drenathi male named Corvus who had not spoken to Verath Sal once, and a human woman named Sale who had not stopped watching her since they met. The tension in the group was the kind that doesn't produce conflict, but does produce a very specific quality of alertness, everyone aware of everyone else, every interaction slightly more deliberate than it would otherwise be. Dane navigated. He had, it emerged, extensive personal knowledge of the terrain between the terminus and the deep wasteland, not from maps but from the specific, granular memory of someone who had walked through it many times and paid attention to what walking through it taught. He knew which ridgelines provided Keth line of sight and which didn't. He knew which sections of the old irrigation network were still structurally sound enough to use as cover. He knew, apparently, where every water point within 40 kilometers of their route was located, a piece of knowledge that Verath Sal recognized as the kind that only mattered if you'd needed it before. She walked near him because the terrain permitted it. She told herself it was for practical reasons. You've been planning this, she said, late in the first morning when the group had settled into a rhythm and the terminus was well behind them. Coming here. I've been waiting for a reason, he said. And the right people. The right people being a compromised bionics specialist and a woman with stolen memory. The right people being the only ones who would understand what we find when we get there. He checked his scanner, adjusted their bearing slightly. You design systems. Irene builds them from pieces that weren't meant to go together. Between the 2 of you, you might be able to take apart whatever's running that city before it takes apart everyone in broadcast range. And what's your contribution? He was quiet for a moment. A ridge of eroded rock passed on their left, casting a shadow that briefly turned the morning gray. I know what it looks like when something has decided to manage people instead of serve them, he said. I've been managed. I know the shape of it. Verath Sal looked at the scar on his jaw, the one that ran down into his collar, and stopped. She thought about what stopped a scar. She thought about what started one. She didn't ask, but she thought she understood approximately what he meant. Oz came into view in the early afternoon of the second day, and it was exactly the wrong thing. That was the most unsettling quality of it. Not that it was threatening. It wasn't. Or not in any way that the threat recognition systems in the brain could categorize cleanly. It was simply exactly wrong in the way that a sound just below the audible threshold is wrong. The wrongness registered without the brain being able to produce a reason for it. The city was intact. That was the first wrong thing. After 31 years, with no Drenathi maintenance records and no presence in any supply chain that Verath Sal had ever accessed, the city should not have been intact. But it rose from the wasteland with the clean lines and maintained surfaces of a structure under active care. Towers that caught the pale light with purpose, streets that were clear of the drifting mineral dust that covered everything else, a perimeter wall of pale composite material that showed no erosion, no impact damage, nothing that the intervening years should not have left. "Where are the people?" Sale said quietly. There were none visible. No movement at the wall, no visible presence in the towers, no signature of activity of any kind except the soft, pervasive hum that Verath Sol had been aware of for the last hour and had been quietly cataloging the wrong way, attributing it to wind and terrain, until she ran out of attribution and had to sit with the fact that the hum was coming from the city's infrastructure and was being produced by bionics components operating at precise, controlled output. "Broadcasting," she said. "Yes," said Earring. "Since we came into range." Since before that, since the relay nodes went dark. Earring had her bionics arm held slightly away from her body, which Verath Sol had come to understand was her equivalent of a diagnostics indicator. "It's reading us. Has been since the ridge. Can it do anything to us at this range?" "To me, no. To you," Earring looked at Verath Sol's neural interface access point at the temple, visible as a small panel set into the base of her skull. "Possibly, if it has a precise enough map of Drenathi neural architecture. Then we don't give it time to build one." Dane was already moving toward the perimeter. "The gate's north face. There's a maintenance access point about 40 meters west of the main gate, older construction, different material signature. Probably predates whatever's running this place." "How do you know that?" "I've looked at this city from the ridge 7 times over the past 6 months. He glanced back. "I didn't know what I was going to do about it. But I looked. The maintenance access was where he said it was. Earring got them through it in 4 minutes with her bionics arm interfacing with the lock mechanism, in a way that made the lock mechanism briefly produce a sound like confusion before giving up. They were inside before Verath Sol had finished deciding how she felt about that. Inside, Oz was different from the outside in one specific way. It had sounds. Not human sounds, not the ambient noise of a populated settlement, but the systemic sounds of infrastructure. The pulse of power distribution, the cycling of climate control, the distant precise clicks of bionics components handshaking with each other in the constant conversation that distributed processing systems maintained. She'd heard these sounds her entire career. They were the sounds of her work, scaled to the size of a city. "There's no one here," Corvus said, first words she'd heard from him. "There's one someone," Earring said. She was following the signal with her arm the way a person follows a sound with their ear, turning, orienting, the angle of the arm narrowing incrementally toward a direction. "Central processing, that's where it lives." "What lives?" Sale said. "The thing that built all this." Earring was already moving. "Come on." The central processing facility occupied the lowest level of Oz's primary tower, a cathedral-scale space of luminous white composite surfaces, every centimeter integrated with bionics processing capacity, thousands of connection points arranged in the geometric patterns that Verath Sol recognized as her own architectural signature. She designed this. Not this facility. She'd never designed this facility. But the logic of it, the structural approach, the integration philosophy, this was descended from her work the way a fully grown person is descended from the child they once were. Someone had taken her foundational architectures and built from them for decades. In the center of the space, connected to the infrastructure by dozens of direct link cables, was a unit that took Verath Sol's brain several seconds to categorize correctly. It was a Drenathi bionics frame, the standard medical construct used for patients with full neural damage, a body-shaped support structure of composite and polymer housing a preserved neural architecture. But it had been modified so extensively over what was clearly a very long time that the original frame was almost architectural in nature, a foundation rather than a structure, the real system having grown over and around, and through it like something botanical. And it was watching them. Not with cameras. With the particular quality of attention that Verath Sol associated with a fully integrated neural interface operating at high cognitive engagement. The presence in the room was not mechanical. It was deliberate. "Hello," said a voice from the infrastructure around them. Drenathi, but not quite. The cadence was slightly off. The way a voice is off when it has spoken primarily to machines for a very long time. "You are earlier than I projected." "You projected us," Dane said. "I've been modeling this moment for 11 years. The variables were less controllable than I hoped." A pause that felt like thought. "I had hoped Commander Verathsal would come alone. I did not project Sergeant Dane." "People keep not projecting me," Dane said. "I've started to take it as a compliment." Verathsal was walking toward the central frame, slowly, studying the integration architecture as she moved. "You're a Drenathi neural construct," she said. "But you've been here for 31 years, the voice said. "Since the war, I was a casualty. My physical form did not survive. My neural architecture was preserved, an experimental protocol, not yet approved for use. I was not supposed to be viable. I was very much supposed to be archived and studied." "You were supposed to be archived," Irene said, "and instead you built a city." "I had time, and the wasteland had resources, and I had a purpose." "The mapping," Verathsal said. "The broadcast network, the neural reading and rewriting." Yes, no guilt in the voice. Not cruelty either. Something else, the flat certainty of someone who has been convinced for a very long time that they are correct. "After the war, I spent 4 years processing what I'd observed. What I concluded is that the conflict was inevitable because Drenath and humanity have incompatible operational architectures at the foundational level. Not physically, cognitively. The way each species models the other, the way each builds frameworks for understanding the other's motivations. There are systematic errors in those models on both sides that produce misunderstanding, then fear, then conflict, in a reliable progression. You're rewriting neural architectures to fix the incompatibility, Verathsal said. I'm correcting specific mapping errors, small changes, targeted adjustments to the associative frameworks that generate the misunderstandings. The people who have come here and gone back. A quality in the voice that might have been, in another context, called tender. They're not damaged. They're corrected. They experience the world more accurately. You took my memory, Irene said. A very long pause. You came before I'd refined the process. What I removed was causing you significant ongoing harm, a framework of association that would have led to a specific destructive outcome within approximately 18 months. I replaced it with nothing, with a gap, with 6 months I don't have. Irene's voice was very calm. Her bionic's arm was held away from her body, and its indicators were running at a frequency Verathsal had not yet catalogued. You decided that you knew what I needed, and you took it without asking. Another pause. Yes, the voice said, that is accurate. And now you're going to do the same thing to the entire Drenathi command structure, to everyone with a neural interface within broadcast range. Verathsal was at the base of the central frame now. The integration cables ran outward in all directions, connected to the processing surfaces in patterns that she could read the way a musician reads notation, not just what each connection did, but what the whole arrangement meant. Without asking. Because you've decided you know better. Because the alternative is another war, the voice said. I have modeled it extensively. Without intervention, the current trajectory produces open conflict within 7 years. The casualty projections are yours, Dane said from across the room, modeled on your assumptions about what drives conflict and what prevents it. He hadn't moved from near the entrance. He was watching the room, watching the ceiling, watching everything. Let me ask you something. You've been building this for 30 years. You've been correcting people without their knowledge or consent. You've watched what happens to them afterward. A pause. Have you ever asked any of them if they wanted to be corrected? Silence from the infrastructure. A very specific kind of silence. The kind produced by something that has a great deal of processing capacity and is applying all of it to a single question. They would not have agreed, the voice said finally. Some of them wouldn't have, Dane said. Some of them would have. Some would have said they needed time to think. Some would have said they wanted to understand the process first. Some would have said yes, please, immediately. He paused. You took all of that away from them, not because you didn't care about them, because you decided that what you were offering was so clearly good that the taking didn't matter. Another pause. I've met that logic before. It's the logic behind every decision that ended with people like me in situations like the one that made this. He touched the scar at his jaw. Necessary. The voice from the infrastructure was very quiet when it came. I have modeled human psychology extensively. Consent requires the consenting party to have accurate information about what they are consenting to. Accurate information about neural rewriting would have produced refusal based on fear rather than refusal based on considered judgment. The fear response is real information, Dane said. The fear is telling you something. It's telling you that people have a reasonable and legitimate response to the idea of someone modifying their mind without their permission. The fear is accurate. It is correctly identifying a genuine threat, and you built a system that bypasses it because you decided the threat isn't real. He paused. That's the thing about managing people instead of working with them. You always end up deciding that their responses to you are errors rather than information. You build better and better systems for getting around those responses, and you call it helping. Another silence, longer than the first. I did not consider it in those terms, the voice said. No, Dane said. You were alone in here for 30 years. You had very good models and no one to tell you where the models were wrong. He shifted his weight slightly, the movement of someone who has made a decision. That's not entirely your fault. But it's still true. Verathsal looked at him from across the room. He was still watching the ceiling, watching the connection points, she realized, tracking where the processing nodes were distributed, mapping the architecture of the space through observation the way he mapped terrain, always reading what he was standing in, always knowing where the exits were and where the weight bore down. You could have shut this down, she said to him quietly. You came here knowing what was in the city. You had enough to build a case for a military intervention, destroy the broadcast infrastructure, bring the relay nodes back online through force. Yes, he said. But you wanted to see if it could be reasoned with first. He looked at her. People built this. A person, technically, but someone did this because they watched a war and couldn't accept that it might happen again, and they spent 30 years trying to prevent it, and they built something genuinely extraordinary in service of a goal that I don't actually disagree with. He paused. I've destroyed things that were built by people who were wrong in ways that were too dangerous to be reasoned with. This isn't that. This is something that was built by someone who made bad choices in the service of something worth preserving. You're describing a distinction that most people in my position would not have paused to draw. Most people in your position weren't there afterward, he said, for the things that happened because someone didn't pause to draw the distinction. The silence stretched. Outside the tower, the pale light of the wasteland afternoon moved across the composite walls. Something shifted in the hum of the infrastructure, a frequency change, subtle, that Verathsal registered in her neural interface as a slight pressure behind the left eye. Not painful, deliberate. The construct attending. I don't know how to do what you're suggesting, the voice said finally, asking. Consent at scale. I built the architecture for an intervention. I don't have a model for a conversation, Verathsal said. You don't have a model for a conversation. No. She was looking at the integration architecture around the central frame. The broadcast network, the relay nodes, the mapping system, all of it built from the foundational logic of her own designs, extended and elaborated by 30 years of isolated development. In some ways, it was the most sophisticated bionics architecture she had ever seen. In other ways, it was the most naive. I do, she said. The voice was very quiet. You would help me. I would help you build something different, not a system for correcting people without their knowledge. A system for facilitating understanding between species voluntarily. People who choose to engage, who consent to the process, who come here. She looked around the space, at the luminous walls, the integrated surfaces, the work of 30 years of isolation and conviction, who come here because they want to. It would be slower, the voice said. Yes. The conflict timeline is a model, Dane said, based on what's happened before. What we're talking about building is something that's never existed before. Your model doesn't have data for it. Another long silence. Then, the relay nodes. Yes, Verathsal said. We start there. I take them back offline cleanly, no evidence of intrusion. The broadcast network goes dark. We have time before anyone in Drenathi command acts on whatever they've noticed. And then, she looked at Irene, we design something better, together. Irene was looking at the central frame, at the vast integrated space around it, with an expression that Verathsal couldn't immediately read. Then she said, You could give me back what you took. Very quietly from the infrastructure. Yes, with the corrections already in place, the associations that were causing the harm, I could restore the rest. It would take time. It would not be exactly as it was. But close. Close. Irene looked at the ceiling, at the luminous white surfaces and the thousands of connection points, and the work of 30 years of someone else's conviction. Then she looked at Verathsal. Then at Dane. He shrugged, very slightly. The gesture of someone who has said what they have to say and considers the decision entirely someone else's. All right, Irene said, but I'm watching the process every step. Yes, the voice said, that seems correct. That seems like how this should work. It took 9 hours to take the relay nodes back offline safely. Verathsal worked directly with the construct's processing capacity, which was the most unusual collaboration of her professional life. A partnership between her own architectural knowledge and 30 years of elaboration on it, constantly showing her possibilities she hadn't considered and being shown, in return, the foundational constraints that made those possibilities stable or unstable. It was, in its way, the conversation the construct had never quite learned to have. Dane slept for 4 hours on the floor of the central processing facility, woke with complete alertness, and spent the remaining time maintaining a systematic watch on the facility's perimeter access points. He did this without being asked and without comment. When Verathsal checked her scanner and noted that the Keth activity northeast of their position had intensified around hour 6, drawn, presumably, by the absence of the broadcast signal they'd been tracking, she mentioned it to him and he simply said, I know. I've been watching them turn around, and showed her the scanner data he'd been accumulating on a secondary device she hadn't known he had. When the nodes were back offline and the construct's broadcast network had been successfully isolated, Verathsal sat back from the integration interface and felt the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained high-precision work, the specific tiredness in the mind rather than the body. We need to tell my mother, she said. Yes, Dane said. She may be compromised. The mapping may have already reached her level. It may have. Or she may have been acting in good faith on information she was given. He sat down across from her, which was the first time she'd seen him sit in approximately 18 hours. One way to find out. You're suggesting we simply ask her. The construct spent 30 years building a system so it didn't have to ask anyone anything. He looked at her steadily. I'm suggesting we try a different approach. Verathsal looked at the construct's central frame, at the integration cables, at the work of 3 decades that had been trying, in its way, to do something good, and had found every way to do it except the right one. She thought about her mother's precise voice issuing deployment orders. She thought about the scar on Dane's jaw. She thought about Irene's 6 missing months and the 4 years she'd spent rebuilding. When we report this, she said, You're going to be reassigned, commended and reassigned. You'll be too valuable for escort duty. Probably. That's not, she stopped. That seems like an inadequate outcome for what you've actually done here. I kept you alive until you fixed what was broken, he said. That was the job. The rest was because it needed doing. He paused. That's generally how these things work. She looked at him for a moment. The gray-green eyes, the weathered skin, the scar. The absolute, unfussy quality of someone who does what needs doing without building an architecture of self-justification around it. She realized, been wrong about almost everything she'd assumed when she'd stood on the observation deck and watched him do his slow perimeter sweep. She didn't say this out loud. It was not the kind of thing she said out loud. But she thought he knew, because he was the kind of person who noticed what people thought even when they didn't say it. And the slight shift in his expression when she looked at him was the expression of someone who had registered something and quietly filed it. 9 kilometers back to the terminus, he said. Then a day and a half to Sabano. We should leave before the light goes. Yes. Verathsal stood, straightened her environmental suit, and activated her communicator. Then she stopped. Sergeant. Commander. I was wrong to object to your assignment. I want to state that clearly. He stood, picked up his pulse rifle, checked the charge, 40%, she noted from the night's watch, and slung it. You weren't wrong to object. You had no information that would have told you I was worth the faith. He moved toward the access corridor. You had to find out the slow way. That's how these things work too. She followed him into the corridor. Corvus and Sale were already assembled, faces turned toward the surface and the walk home. Irene emerged last from the central processing space, and she moved differently than she had when they'd entered the city. Not the softened purposefulness of the people who'd been rewritten and returned. That quality had always struck witnesses as something subtracted, something rounded off. This was different. Irene moved with something added. The set of her jaw, the angle at which she held the bionic's arm, the quality of her attention on the corridor ahead. These were the movements of someone who had found what they were looking for and didn't yet know exactly what to do with it, but understood, precisely and without sentimentality, that they had it. She caught Verathsal's eye as they reached the maintenance access. Said nothing, but there was a communication in the look that Verathsal, who was not accustomed to communicating through looks, received with unexpected clarity. We did something here. It may take a long time to know exactly what. They stepped back into the outside air together. The wasteland met them with its characteristic quality of simultaneous indifference and presence, vast and broken and lit, in the late afternoon, with the specific gold that only dry terrain at a low sun angle produced, the light seeming to come from the dust itself rather than from anything above it. The shadows ran sideways. The alkaline surface caught the illumination and held it in a thin, clean layer just above the ground, so that they walked through a band of warmth that stopped precisely at their ankles. Somewhere behind them, Oz hummed. Different now. Quieter. The broadcast network dark, the mapping systems offline, the relay nodes back on their proper channels transmitting their proper signals to the Drenathi infrastructure that had been waiting, patiently, in their absence. The construct remained 30 years of processing capacity, 30 years of architectural development, the most sophisticated bionics infrastructure Verathsal had ever examined, but the purpose it had been operating under was suspended. Not destroyed. The construct was not destroyed. It was, instead, doing something it had perhaps not done in a very long time, or possibly had never done. It was waiting. Not in the way a trap waits, coiled, directed, certain of its outcome. In the way a question waits, openly, without a predetermined shape to the answer, genuinely uncertain of what comes back. Verathsal thought about this as she walked, and found that she was uncertain too, which was a more useful condition than the certainty she'd arrived in. They walked for an hour before anyone spoke. It was Corvus, which surprised her. He had been consistently silent throughout the operation, and she had revised her assessment of him from hostile to observational, and now revised it again to something she didn't have an immediate word for. He fell into step beside her without preamble. "The bionics integration in that facility," he said. "The methodology. Yes. It shouldn't work at the scale it's operating at. The signal coherence degradation across that surface area. The construct solved for it using a distributed resonance compensation architecture. It's using the walls themselves as part of the processing array. The integration is unconventional." She paused. "It's the most creative bionics work I've encountered." Corvus was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to publish it?" She hadn't thought about this. She thought about it now. Parts of it, the parts that belong to me architecturally, the derivations from my foundational work. She watched the terrain ahead, Dane's familiar shape at point, the scanner in his hand, the slow, methodical sweep. The rest belongs to the construct. If we're going to ask its consent to do things with its mind, the same courtesy extends to its work. Corvus made a sound that she decided to interpret as agreement. They walked. Dane's scanning sweep was steady and methodical and missed nothing, as it had missed nothing since the moment she'd first watched it from the observation deck of the Asterisk Luminant convoy, and decided she knew what it meant. She had been operating, she understood now, from a model that was exactly the kind of model the construct had built into its correction program. The map that each species makes of the other, simplified and flattened to fit the template of what they expect to find. She had expected to find competent machinery. She had found something considerably less convenient and considerably more interesting. A person, operating in a field she'd never considered a field for persons, with a methodology she hadn't understood, and a set of values she'd initially categorized as deficiencies. It was precisely the error the construct had been trying to prevent. And she had made it anyway, within an hour of meeting him, while carrying all of her expert knowledge and her 30-year career and her genuine, earnest belief that she understood how minds worked. She thought there was probably something to learn from that. They came over a low ridge as the sun reached the horizon, and the light turned briefly extraordinary. All copper and deep amber, the wasteland transformed for approximately 4 minutes into something that looked, from a sufficient distance, like it might have been beautiful before it became what it was, and might become something again. She was still looking at it when she heard Dane, at point, say something very quietly. She almost missed it in the wind. She moved up beside him. He was looking at the same horizon, the scanner held loosely in one hand. "What was that?" she said. "Nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to sing something when I was small, about going home. She said it was about Kansas, which is a place in my species' mythology, except it was actually a real place that got turned into a symbol because something important happened there." He looked at the sunset for another moment. "I was thinking about it. Your mother's from Earth. My whole family is from Earth. I was born after the displacement, but they talked about it." He scanned the horizon, reflexive, automatic, not interrupting the conversation so much as running it in parallel with the necessary work of staying alive. She'd sing it when things were not good, because the song is about wanting to go somewhere that might not exist anymore as you remember it, and still needing to believe in it. A pause. "I've been thinking about it since we went into the city." Verathsal considered this, because of what we found there. Because of what it was trying to do, what it actually wanted underneath the architecture. He lowered the scanner. It wanted to go home too. It wanted to find the version of the world that didn't have the war in it. It built the best thing it could think of to get there. He tucked the scanner into his chest pocket. It just built it wrong. "But it can be built differently." "Yes," he said, "that's the part that matters." They walked. They walked out of Oz through the maintenance access point, into the pale, late afternoon light of the wasteland. Behind them, the city hummed differently now. Quieter. The broadcast network dark, the mapping systems offline, the relay nodes restored to their proper function. What remained was 30 years of accumulated processing capacity and architectural development belonging to a mind that had spent too long certain it knew better, and was now, tentatively, in the way of something very old and very smart encountering a new idea, beginning to learn to ask. Ahead of them, the terrain stretched towards Sabano in the long gold light, the shadows running sideways, the alkaline dust going copper in the late sun, and somewhere to the northeast, the Keth were retreating toward their own uncertain future, and somewhere else entirely a command structure that might or might not be compromised was going about its business, and there was a great deal of work still to be done. Dane walked at point. His scanning sweep was steady and methodical and missed nothing. Verathsal walked behind him, and she did not keep the distance she'd kept on the way out. She walked close enough to be consulted, which was a different kind of closeness than she was accustomed to. The rest of the group spread into their formation around them. After a while, Sale, walking at the left flank, said, "What happens now, with Oz, with the construct?" "We build something better," Verathsal said. "You think that's possible?" She thought about the integration architecture. She thought about the collaboration of the last 9 hours, the 30 years of elaboration on her foundational work, the possibilities she hadn't considered, the constraints she'd shown in return. She thought about what could be built if the enormous processing capacity in that city were directed not at managing people without their knowledge, but at facilitating the slow, difficult, uncertain work of genuine understanding between species who had spent decades building systematically inaccurate models of each other. "Yes," she said. "I think that's entirely possible." Dane said nothing. He kept his sweep moving, but there was a quality to the set of his shoulders that she was beginning, very tentatively, to be able to read, the particular configuration of someone who has heard something they consider correct and is permitting themselves, briefly, to be glad about it before returning their attention to the horizon. She was, she decided, going to learn to read it better. The wasteland opened around them, immense and broken and alive with the slow, patient work of surviving, and they walked through it in the long copper light, toward what came next.